What if your entire worth, your future, and perhaps even your survival depended on a single drop of blood staining a white linen sheet? This is not a gruesome fairy tale, but the terrifying reality found throughout the history of virginity testing, a practice that reduced women to biological commodities for centuries. For thousands of years, across empires and peasant villages alike, the morning after a wedding was not a time of intimate whispers or romantic reflection, but a moment of cold, clinical judgment where a woman's life hung in the balance of a biological lottery. Imagine the scene. It is the dawn of the 16th century, somewhere in the rolling hills of Europe, though the location matters less than the ritual itself. The sun is just beginning to crest over the horizon, casting long, pale shadows across the stone floor of the bridal chamber. The air is cold, heavy with the scent of beeswax candles that have burned down to nothing but nubs during the long, agonizing night. In the center of the room stands the marriage bed, a piece of furniture that is ostensibly for rest and union, but in this context, serves as an altar of sacrifice. Standing beside it are the newlyweds. The groom, perhaps relieved, perhaps indifferent, looks on, but the bride stands frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Her eyes are not fixed on her new husband, nor on the morning light. They are fixed, with a paralyzed intensity, on the bedsheet. Time 0.5s. She is waiting for the door to open. She is waiting for the witnesses. In many traditions, the mothers, the aunts, or even the town elders would be gathering in the hallway right now. They are not there to wish the couple happiness. They are there to inspect the evidence. They are there to see the tokens of virginity. If the sheet bears the crimson signature of her purity, she will be celebrated. Feast days will continue. Her father will retain the dowry price, and she will be accepted as a valid vessel for the family line. She becomes a wife. But if that sheet is white, if the linen remains pristine and unstained, the silence that follows will be louder than any scream. In that silence, her life effectively ends. A clean sheet meant a dirty bride. It meant she was damaged goods, a fraud who had tricked a man into purchasing a compromised product. The consequences of that white sheet could range from public humiliation and a lifetime of servitude to immediate annulment, or in the darker corners of history, a swift and brutal execution at the hands of her own kin to cleanse the family's honor. This obsession with the proof of purity was not merely a quirky cultural tradition, it was the backbone of patriarchal economics. To understand why this practice was so pervasive, one must strip away the modern notions of romance and love. History is rarely romantic. History is transactional. In the medieval and early modern mind, a marriage was a business merger. It was the transferring of property, the woman, from one owner, the father, to another owner, the husband. The virginity of the bride was the seal on the contract. It was the guarantee that the merchandise was new, unused, and exclusively the property of the buyer. Why was this physical exclusivity so paramount? It was never truly about morality, though priests and imams would thunder from pulpits that it was a divine commandment. At its core, it was about lineage. In a world without DNA testing, without paternity suits, and without reliable records, a man had only one way to ensure that the children he raised, fed, and left his land to were actually his. He had to ensure he was the first and only man to ever know his wife. The hymen, a thin and misunderstood membrane, time 0.3s, became the padlock on his genetic legacy. If the lock was broken before he arrived, the security of his entire bloodline was compromised. Thus, the bride's body was scrutinized with the same intensity a merchant might use to inspect a shipment of grain or a bolt of silk. The psychological toll this took on young women is almost impossible for the modern mind to fully grasp. Consider that, for most of history, sex education was non-existent. A young girl, often no older than 14 or 15, would be sent into the bridal chamber knowing nothing of her own anatomy. She would have been told only that she must submit and that she must bleed. She lived her entire adolescence in the shadow of this impending test. Every movement, every accident, every strenuous chore might have caused her to worry. Had she broken the seal? Had she accidentally destroyed her own value? Mothers would whisper terrifying warnings to their daughters, instilling a deep, primal fear of their own bodies. A girl might act with perfect virtue. She might pray daily and never so much as look at a man, yet she could still fail the test due to the simple, biological reality that the human body varies. But history did not care for biological nuance. It cared for symbols, and the symbol of the blood was absolute. The ritual of the sheet became a theater of the grotesque. In some cultures, the stained linen would be paraded through the streets the next morning, held aloft on a pole like a war banner, while the village cheered. The bride's most private, time 0.3's intimate moment was externalized, turned into a public receipt of the transaction. The town would feast, not just because two people were married, but because the goods had been verified. Conversely, the absence of blood could turn a wedding feast into a funeral wake in the span of a heartbeat. Guests would be sent home, the food left to rot, and the bride cast out, labeled a harlot regardless of her actual history. As we embark on this journey into the shadows of the past, I must ask you to leave your modern sensibilities at the door. We are entering a world where biology was destiny, and where a woman's character was judged not by her heart or her mind, but by a fragile piece of tissue. It is a story of ignorance, of control, and of the desperate, terrifying measures women took to survive a system rigged against them. If you have the bravery to stare into the abyss of these forgotten lives, to witness the silent screams of those who failed the test, then you are ready to proceed. We must peel back the layers of time to understand where this obsession began. It did not start in the castles of medieval Europe. The roots of this control go much deeper, into the marble halls of the ancient world, where the concept of female purity was first forged into a weapon of state power. The question remains, how did a biological myth become a law of iron and blood? To answer that, we must travel back to the civilizations that built the foundations of our world, where the chastity of a few women was believed to hold the power to save or destroy an entire empire. To understand the machinery of control that imprisoned women for millennia, we must look beyond the mud and thatch of the Middle Ages. We must turn our gaze to the sun-drenched marble of antiquity, to the civilizations that claimed to invent democracy and law. It is here, among the philosophers and emperors, that the value of chastity in history was first codified, transformed from a private preference into a matter of national security. In the ancient world, a woman's purity was not merely a domestic concern, it was the mortar that held the state together. If the mortar crumbled, the empire would fall. In the heart of ancient Rome, a fire burned that was never allowed to die. This was the temple of Vesta, the goddess of the hearth. The flame represented the eternal life of Rome itself. If it were extinguished, it was believed that disaster would befall the city, plague, famine, or military defeat. Tending to this sacred fire were the Vestal Virgins, 6 priestesses chosen from the noblest families before they had even reached puberty. These women were anomalies in the Roman world. Unlike other women, they could own property, they could make wills, and their word in court was accepted without an oath. They were so powerful that if a condemned criminal merely saw a Vestal on his way to execution, he was automatically pardoned. They walked through the streets with the lictors, the bodyguards usually reserved for magistrates. They were the physical embodiment of Rome's sanctity. But this power came at a terrifying price. Their bodies were not their own. They belonged to the Republic. Their virginity was literally tied to the safety of the state. For the 30 years of their service, they had to remain untouched by man. A Vestal's chastity was the magical barrier protecting the city walls. If she broke her vow, it was not considered a simple moral failing or a personal sin. It was viewed as incestum, a pollution so vile that it disrupted the relationship between Rome and the gods. When a Vestal was accused of unchastity, the trial was a national spectacle of fear. The evidence was often circumstantial. Perhaps the sacred fire had sputtered out, or perhaps a plague had struck the city, and the populace needed a scapegoat. Once convicted, the method of her execution was designed with a chilling, bureaucratic cruelty. Roman law forbade the spilling of a Vestal's blood within the city, as her person was sacred. So, the architects of Roman justice devised a punishment that required no blade and no blood. They would bury her alive. Imagine the procession. The condemned priestess would be dressed in funeral robes, stripped of her ribbons and regalia. She would be placed in a covered litter, the straps fastened tight so her screams could not be heard, effectively silencing her before she was even dead. The procession would wind its way through the forum, the crowds standing in a terrified, reverent silence. This was not a rowdy execution. It was a funeral for a woman who was still breathing. Upon reaching the campus, Sceleratus, or the field of wickedness, she would be led to an open hole in the ground. Below lay a small underground chamber. Inside, the state provided the barest essentials of life: a couch, a lamp, and small portions of bread, water, milk, and oil. This was not mercy. This was a technicality. By providing her with food, the Romans could claim they had not killed her. They had simply left her to the judgment of the gods. If Vesta wished to save her, she could. The priestess would descend the ladder into the gloom. The ladder was then pulled up. Above her, the opening was bricked over, and earth was shoveled onto the mound until the ground was flat, erasing all trace of the entrance. Down in the darkness, the air would grow heavy and stale. The lamp would eventually flicker and die, plunging her into an absolute, suffocating blackness. One can only imagine the psychological horror of those final hours or days. The silence, the cold, the realization that the city she had served was walking, laughing, and trading directly above her head, while she slowly asphyxiated in a stone box. Her virginity had been the currency of the empire, and having been deemed spent or counterfeit, she was discarded into the earth. This brutal theater served a clear purpose. It reinforced the idea that a woman's sexual integrity was a matter of life and death for the community. While the Vestals were an extreme example, the logic applied to every woman in the ancient world. In ancient Greece, particularly in Athens, the cradle of democracy, the obsession with female purity was driven by the intense jealousy of citizenship. To be an Athenian citizen was a rare and coveted privilege. It granted rights, protections, and access to power. In 451 BC, the statesman Pericles passed a law stating that a man could only be a citizen if both his parents were citizens. Suddenly, the womb of the Athenian wife became a fortress that had to be guarded with paranoid intensity. If a wife had an affair with a foreigner or a slave, and the resulting child passed as the husband's heir, the purity of the entire city-state was corrupted. An impostor would be voting in the assembly. A fraud would be inheriting the ancestral lands. Thus, the Greek home, the oikos, was designed as a prison. Respectable women were sequestered in the gymnasium, the women's quarters, usually located at the back or on the upper floors of the house. far away from the street and the prying eyes of strange men. A woman seen wandering alone was assumed to be a prostitute or a slave. For a citizen's wife, visibility was shame. Her value lay in her invisibility and her inaccessibility. The great philosophers, men whose logic we still study today, provided the intellectual justification for this control. Aristotle, the tutor of kings, famously described the female as a deformed male, time 0.5s. He argued that women lacked the internal heat to fully process their blood into seed, rendering them passive vessels. In this worldview, the man provided the form or the soul of the child, while the woman provided only the matter. She was merely the soil in which the seed was planted. And just as a farmer must fence off his field to prevent others from sowing in his earth, a man had to enclose his wife. If the soil was mixed, the harvest was ruined. This commodification of the female body in antiquity set a heavy precedent. It established the legal and social framework that viewed virginity as an asset that could be stolen, damaged, or devalued. If a man raped a virgin in ancient law, the crime was often not considered an assault against the woman's personhood, but a property crime against her father. The perpetrator had damaged the merchandise, lowering its market value. The reparations were paid to the father, not the victim. The woman was merely the broken vessel, the evidence of the crime. As the pillars of Rome crumbled and the fires of Vesta were finally extinguished, one might hope that this brutal utilitarianism would vanish with them. But history rarely discards a tool of control. It merely sharpens it. The collapse of the ancient empires gave way to a new power, one that would take the concept of purity and elevate it from a civic duty to a celestial requirement. The architects of the Middle Ages would look at the laws of Rome and the philosophy of Greece and find them wanting. They didn't just want to control the body for the sake of the state. They wanted to control the soul for the sake of God. The transition was subtle but devastating. The Vestal Virgin died in the dark to save the city. The medieval bride would be told that her virginity was the only thing standing between her and eternal hellfire. We are leaving the marble tombs of Rome and entering the incense-choked cathedrals of Christendom. Here, the test of virginity will evolve. It will cease to be just about citizenship and inheritance. It will become a weapon of theology, where biology is interpreted by priests who despise the flesh. The stakes are about to rise. In the ancient world, an unchaste woman might lose her life. In the medieval world, she was told she would lose her soul. As the sun set on the pagan empires of antiquity, a new shadow stretched across the European continent, long and cold. In the chaotic vacuum left by Rome's fall, the Catholic Church rose not just as a spiritual guide, but as the supreme arbiter of law, morality, and daily life. In this new order, the medieval bride value was no longer calculated merely in coins, cattle, or citizenship rights. It was calculated in the currency of salvation. The stakes had shifted from the political to the metaphysical. A woman's chastity was no longer just a guarantee of a husband's heirs. It became the solitary metric by which her soul was weighed, measured, and frequently found wanting. To understand the crushing weight placed upon the medieval woman, time 0.3s, one must first understand the story that defined her existence before she was even born. In the eyes of the Church Fathers, men like Tertullian, Jerome, and Augustine, every woman was a daughter of Eve. Eve was the original temptress, the one who had listened to the serpent, eaten the forbidden fruit, and dragged humanity out of paradise and into a world of suffering and death. Tertullian, in a particularly biting address to women, famously wrote, "You are the devil's gateway. On account of your desert, that is, death, even the Son of God had to die." This was the heavy mantle placed on the shoulders of every girl child. She was born with a spiritual deficit. Her very nature was viewed as suspect, prone to size, time, 0.3s, weakness, and the corruption of men. How could such a creature redeem herself? How could the devil's gateway become a vessel of grace? There was only one path offered, the negation of her sexuality. If Eve represented the fall through carnal knowledge and disobedience, the Virgin Mary represented redemption through purity and submission. The cult of the Virgin Mary exploded in popularity during the High Middle Ages, presenting women with an impossible ideal. Mary was the Virgo intacta, the perfect mother who had conceived without the stain of intercourse. She was the locked garden, the sealed fountain. For the medieval bride, this created a devastating dichotomy. She was expected to emulate Mary's purity, yet she was destined for a marriage bed that the Church itself viewed with deep ambivalence. For centuries, the early Church had regarded marriage as a necessary evil, a concession to human frailty for those who lacked the willpower for celibacy. St. Paul had written, "It is better to marry than to burn," hardly a ringing endorsement of wedded bliss. Consequently, the act of consummation, even within marriage, was often tainted with the residue of shame. It was a duty, a means of procreation, but it was inextricably linked to concupiscence, the lust of the flesh. Therefore, a bride approaching her wedding night was walking a terrifying tightrope. She had to be a virgin to be a valid wife, but the very act of becoming a wife involved a loss of that supreme spiritual statue. Time 0.55s. This theological framework turned the female body into a battleground between God and the devil. The physical evidence of virginity, the hymen, was elevated to a sacred seal. It was thought to be God's own stamp on the vessel, a divine packaging that proved the contents were untouched by Satan's influence. The obsession with the physical intactness became so extreme that it began to warp the understanding of biology itself. Theologians and early medical texts debated the nature of this seal with a fervor that bordered on madness. Was it a physical barrier? A spiritual aura? Could it be broken by vigorous exercise, by a fall, or even by an impure thought? This paranoia seeped into the very stone and mortar of the medieval world. The architecture of the time reflected the obsession with enclosure and protection. Just as the castle walls protected the kingdom, and the monastery walls protected the monks, the clothing and customs of women were designed to fortress the body. The wimple, the veil, the high collars, all served to hide the dangerous flesh from view, to keep the seal secure until the appointed moment of transfer. But the Church did not trust women to guard this treasure themselves. A woman was considered intellectually and morally weaker than a man, easily swayed by her passions. Therefore, she required constant surveillance. The priest in the confessional booth became the inspector of her thoughts, probing for sins of impurity that might precede a physical fall. Did you look at a man with lust? Did you entertain thoughts of the flesh? The mental landscape of the medieval girl was policed as rigorously as her physical movements. She was taught that her purity was a fragile crystal chalice she was forced to carry through a battlefield. One slip, one moment of inattention, and it would shatter, leaving her with nothing. This internal surveillance was matched by external pressure. As the Middle Ages progressed, the Church began to take a more active role in the marriage ceremony itself. In the early medieval period, marriages were often private contracts between families, sometimes conducted at the door of the church or in a private home. But by the 12th and 13th centuries, the Church asserted its control, transforming marriage into a sacrament. This meant the union was now under the jurisdiction of canon law. The scrutiny of the bride became a matter of ecclesiastical procedure. If a man accused his new wife of not being a virgin, he wasn't just complaining about damaged merchandise. He was claiming that the sacrament was invalid. An annulment could be granted if it was proven that the woman had been previously known. This led to ecclesiastical courts becoming deeply, invasively involved in the bedroom. Judges and priests would hear detailed, graphic testimony about the wedding night. They would examine the tokens of virginity. The private intimacy of the couple was dissected by celibate men in robes, who pored over the details with a mix of theological rigor and, one suspects, repressed voyeurism. The horror of this system lay in its inescapability. A woman could not opt out. If she chose not to marry, her only respectable alternative was the convent, where she would become a bride of Christ. Even there, the obsession with virginity remained. Nuns were consecrated virgins, and their spiritual rank was determined by their physical state. A widow who became a nun could never achieve the same spiritual holiness as a virgin who became a nun. The biological fact of having been touched by a man, even a lawful husband, permanently altered her spiritual value. For the secular bride, the pressure culminated on the wedding night, which the church had surrounded with a thick fog of ritual and superstition. The bed was often blessed by the priest with holy water and incense to drive away demons that might cause impotence or barrenness. But this blessing also served to remind the couple that God was watching. The eye of God was fixed on the sheets. The bride knew that her performance that night, her ability to bleed, to show pain, to prove her honesty, was a test ordained by the Almighty. Failure was not just a social disaster, it was a sign of divine disfavor. A woman who failed to bleed was seen as having deceived not just her husband, but the church. She was a liar in the eyes of God. This fear was compounded by the folk beliefs of the time. It was whispered that the devil could steal a woman's virginity in her sleep, or that witches could repair a lost maidenhead with dark magic. The air was thick with paranoia. Every bride was a suspect until proven innocent by the blood. As the Middle Ages waned and the courts of Europe grew more elaborate, this theological control began to merge with the increasing power of the monarchy. The scrutiny of the bride moved from the confessional booth to the royal chamber. The abstract fear of God's judgment was replaced by the very real, very staring eyes of the king's courtiers. We are approaching the era of the absolute monarchs, where the king's body was the state, and the queen's body was the factory of the state. The private religious test was about to transform into a public spectacle of humiliation that defies modern comprehension. The priest is leaving the room, and the audience is filing in. The doors are being bolted, but not to keep people out, to keep them in. Imagine a bedroom crowded with dukes, bishops, and ladies-in-waiting, all gathering around the mattress, waiting for the show to begin. The bedding ceremony is about to start, and for the royal bride, there is nowhere to hide. We often imagine the lives of royalty as a fairy tale existence, silk gowns, golden crowns, and the ultimate luxury of doing exactly as one pleases. But if we peel back the velvet curtains of history, we find that a king or queen had less privacy than the lowliest peasant in the field. For the peasant, the wedding night was at least a moment of darkness and quiet. For the royal bride, it was a state occasion. The royal bedding ceremony stands as one of the most bizarre and suffocating rituals in the annals of European history, a moment where the most intimate human act was transformed into a grotesque piece of political theater. To understand this spectacle, one must realize that a royal marriage was never about two people falling in love. Time 0.5s. It was a treaty signed in flesh. It was a merger between corporations, designed to end wars, secure borders, or gain territory. And like any high-stakes business deal, it required witnesses. The ambassadors and courtiers could not simply take the couple's word that the union had been sealed. They needed proof. If the marriage was not consummated, the treaty could be declared void, the dowry returned, and the war restarted. The stability of nations literally rested on what happened between the sheets. Picture the scene at a high-status wedding in the 16th or 17th century, perhaps in the stifling, perfume-heavy air of the French court, or the drafty stone chambers of a Tudor palace. The feast has ended, but the guests do not go home. Instead, a raucous, drunken procession forms. Musicians play bawdy tunes, and the guests, flushed with wine and anticipation, march the newlyweds to the bridal chamber. This is not a polite escort, it is a mob. The room is already packed. The bedding was a rite of passage that involved the entire hierarchy of the court. There are archbishops in their finery, holding holy water to exorcise the mattress. There are parents, anxious for the alliance to hold. There are foreign ambassadors, holding quills and paper, ready to write back to their own monarchs with the good news. And there are the courtiers, the social climbers, jostling for a better view, treating the event with the jeering energy of a spectator sport. The ritual of undressing was highly formalized. The king would be stripped by his male courtiers, often engaging in ribald jokes, while the queen was undressed by her ladies-in-waiting. Every layer of silk and lace removed was a shedding of her individual identity, reducing her further to her biological function. Once stripped to their shifts, or sometimes, depending on the era and the specific court, completely naked, they were physically lifted and placed into the great bed. This was the moment of the bedding. The curtains would be drawn, but the crowd did not leave. In many traditions, the priest would bless the couple in the bed, sprinkling them with holy water, chanting prayers for fertility over their prone body, time 0.5s. Then, the drinking of the posset would commence, a heavy, spiced milk curdle laced with alcohol, which the couple was forced to drink to give them strength and vigor. The cup would be passed around, with guests sitting on the edge of the bed, offering advice, making crude jests, and staring at the terrified young woman who was often meeting her husband for the first time that very day. In the most extreme cases, the witnesses did not leave at all. History records instances, particularly in the earlier medieval periods or during highly contested successions, where select witnesses remained in the room or just outside the thin tapestry door, listening for the sounds of consummation. For the young bride, often a teenager who had been raised in a convent or a sheltered nursery, the psychological pressure was agonizing. She had to perform a painful, frightening, and unknown act while the most powerful people in her world stood feet away, listening, judging, and waiting. The morning after was the final act of this humiliation. The inspection of the sheets was not a private family matter. It was a bureaucratic necessity. The stained linen was often displayed to the assembled peers or the foreign ambassadors. This blood was the ink that signed the peace treaty. Without it, the bride was a failure. There are records of queens being sent back home, their marriages annulled, because they failed to provide this public proof. Consider the case of Catherine of Aragon and Prince Arthur, time 0.3s, the older brother of Henry VIII. Their wedding night was the subject of intense scrutiny and debate for decades. Did Arthur know her? Did they consummate? The young prince's boast the next morning, demanding ale because he had been in the midst of Spain, became a piece of legal evidence that would eventually tear the English church apart. The entire English Reformation, the break with Rome, and the execution of queens turned on the question of what happened in a dark room between two teenagers in 1501. This lack of privacy stripped the royal bride of her humanity. She was a broodmare of the state. Her body was national property. The royal bedding ceremony sent a clear message. You do not own yourself. Your modesty is irrelevant. Your comfort is irrelevant. Your only value lies in your ability to be filled, to be verified, and to produce a male heir. Yet, as horrific as the bedding ceremony was, It at least occurred after the wedding vows were exchanged. The bride had the protection of being a wife, even if that protection was flimsy. But for some women, the suspicion of their impurity was so great, and the stakes so high, that the men in charge decided they could not afford to wait until the wedding night to find out the truth. Time 0.5s. They needed to know before the contract was signed. This paranoia gave rise to an even darker practice, a preemptive strike against the female body. The courts and the councils began to authorize a procedure that stripped away even the pretense of romance. It was a cold, clinical search for the truth, conducted not by husbands, but by strangers. The priest and the courtier stepped back, and a new figure emerged from the shadows to take control of the bride's fate. She was the searcher, the matron, the midwife, and she carried with her not a ring or a blessing, but the terrifying authority of the state to invade the most private sanctuary of a woman's body. The wedding dates were set, the feasts were prepared, but everything would grind to a halt for the jury of matrons. The bride is waiting in a cold antechamber. The door opens. It is not her groom. It is a group of stern-faced women, rolling up their sleeves. The inspection is about to begin. The public bedding ceremony was a theater of humiliation, a performance where the bride was the passive star. But there existed a darker, quieter chapter in the bride inspection history of Europe, a chapter that stripped away even the pretense of celebration. While the bedding was a ritual of the wedding night, this ordeal occurred in the cold light of day, often days or weeks before the vows were even spoken. It was the moment when the machinery of the state and the church decided that the word of a woman was not enough, nor was the trust of her betrothed. They needed a verdict, delivered by the hands of experts. Enter the jury of matrons. In the legal and social structures of the time, when a question of a woman's physical state arose, whether she was pregnant to delay an execution, or whether she was a virgin to validate a marriage contract, men, for all their power, were forced to step back. The male gaze was considered insufficient, or perhaps too easily deceived by lust. The task fell to the searchers. These were not the kindly midwives of folklore who brought life into the world with warm water and soft towels. In this context, they were the inquisitors of the flesh. These women were typically older, respected members of the community or the court, hardened by life and deeply entrenched in the patriarchal systems they served. They were appointed by judges or bishops, sworn under holy oath to seek the truth without favor or malice. But to the young girl standing shivering in a drafty antechamber, they must have looked like executioners. The setting for this inspection was stark. There were no flowers, no music, no feasting guests. It was a sterile, purely transactional environment. The bride would be ordered to undress, not for a lover, but for a panel of strangers. The humiliation was total. Every layer of clothing removed was a layer of dignity stripped away. She stood before them, a specimen to be catalogued. The atmosphere was heavy with a unique brand of tension. The silence of a courtroom transposed into the intimacy of a bedroom. The examination itself was a brutal invasio. Time 0.5s. The matrons were tasked with verifying the signaculum pudoris, the seal of shame, or the hymen. With cold, clinical hands, they would probe and inspect the young woman's body, looking for the physical barrier that the medical and theological texts of the time insisted must exist. They would discuss her anatomy amongst themselves as if she were a piece of livestock, using coarse terminology, debating the state of her integrity. Was the passage too open? Was the seal intact? Was there evidence of friction or use? For a noblewoman or a princess, the stakes of this inspection were astronomical. A negative verdict from the jury of matrons could collapse a dynasty. There are records of diplomatic negotiations stalling while ambassadors awaited the report from the midwives. In some high-profile annulment cases, the inspection became a public matter of record. The details of the woman's genitalia were written down in Latin legal briefs, copied by clerks, and read aloud in court. Her most private geography became a map studied by lawyers and priests. The psychological violence of this moment cannot be overstated. The bride was forced to dissociate, to leave her body while it was handled and judged. She was being told, in the most visceral way possible, that her body was a vessel for the honor of others. If the matrons found her wanting, she was not just physically spoiled in their eyes. She was a fraud, a perjurer. She had attempted to sell damaged goods to a husband. The report of the matrons was final. There was no appeal. If they said she was not a virgin, the marriage contract was torn up. Her family was disgraced, and she was often ruined for life. Conversely, passing the test did not bring relief, only a temporary reprieve. The invasion of the inspection established a precedent. Her body was subject to audit at any time. It reinforced the terrifying reality that her physical self was a state asset, monitored and regulated. What makes this chapter of history truly horrifying is the immense power placed in the hands of these searchers, combined with the utter lack of scientific knowledge they possessed. The jury of matrons were not doctors. They were women operating on folk wisdom, superstition, and the rigid, often incorrect, anatomical assumptions of the era. They were looking for a specific, unbreakable seal that simply does not exist in the way they imagined. They were searching for a standard of purity that was biologically inconsistent. A woman could be a virgin and fail the test because of her natural anatomy. A woman could be sexually experienced and pass the test due to the elasticity of her body. The verdict of the matrons was a roll of the dice, disguised as a medical finding. Yet, on this roll of the dice, inheritances were decided, queens were crowned or cast aside, and wars were averted or ignited. The arrogance of this ignorance is chilling. The men who ordered the inspections and the women who performed them believed with absolute certainty that the female body was a solvable puzzle, a lock with a clear key. They believed that nature had stamped a guarantee of quality on women, and that they had the skill to read it. They were wrong. As the bride dressed herself again, trembling and shamed, she was often unaware that the entire ordeal had been a farce. She had been judged by a standard that was physically impossible to apply with 100% accuracy. The world was destroying lives based on a fundamental misunderstanding of human biology. The hymen that the matrons sought, the heavy, bleeding barrier of legend, was largely a myth constructed by men who had never bothered to study the very bodies they sought to control. And it is this myth of anatomy, that we must dismantle next. For centuries, millions of women were held hostage by a piece of tissue that the medical experts of the time couldn't even agree existed. The door to the examination room closes, but the tragedy is just beginning. We have seen the social ritual and the legal inspection. Now we must look at the science, or the lack thereof. We must look at the medical texts that lay open on the desks of the scholars, texts that were filled with errors, fantasies, and dangerous lies. How is it possible that for 2,000 years, civilization based its entire moral code on a body part that they didn't understand? The answer lies in the willful blindness of a patriarchy that preferred a convenient lie to a complex truth. For centuries, the ultimate proof of purity was believed to be a physical, tangible barrier, a gate that God Himself had installed to protect the sanctity of the female form. The logic was elegant in its simplicity. If the gate was closed, the woman was virtuous. If the gate was open, she was corrupted. But there was a devastating flaw in this system, a flaw that cost countless women their reputations and their lives. The flaw was that the gate, as the men of history imagined it, did not exist. The tragedy of the virginity test lies in the colossal gap between historical belief and biological reality. The learned men of the past, the doctors, the theologians, the judges, operated under the assumption that the hymen was a uniform, standardized seal. They imagined it like a piece of parchment stretched across a drum, designed to break and bleed upon the first instance of penetration. This belief was so deeply ingrained that it superseded the evidence of their own eyes. When a woman failed to bleed, they did not question their medical understanding. They questioned her morality. In reality, the anatomy of the hymen is wildly variable. It is not a solid wall, it is a membrane, a fringe of tissue that frames the vaginal opening. For some women, it is thick and vascular. For others, it is thin and elastic. For a rare few, it is almost non-existent from birth. But the most dangerous fact for the medieval bride was that this tissue could be worn away by the simple act of living. A childhood spent riding horses, climbing trees, or performing heavy labor could stretch or tear the membrane long before a woman ever reached the marriage bed. Consider the horror of this biological roulette. Time 0.5s. A peasant girl who had spent her life working the fields, whose body was strong and capable, might have failed the test on her wedding night simply because her daily toil had naturally altered her anatomy. She would be branded a harlot, cast out or beaten, purely because she had been an active, living human being. Conversely, a woman with a more elastic anatomy might engage in intercourse and not tear the tissue, resulting in no blood. In the binary mind of the past, the innocent were condemned, and the guilty went undetected, all because the test was based on a fundamental anatomical error. The medical community of the time was complicit in this ignorance. While some ancient texts hinted at the variability of the female form, the prevailing medieval and early modern view was rigid. Medical diagrams often depicted the hymen as a literal flower or a distinct barrier, reinforcing the cultural metaphor of deflowering. It wasn't until the 16th century, with the rise of anatomists like Andreas Vesalius, that cracks began to appear in this dogma. Vesalius, who dissected human cadavers to understand the body, famously stated that he could not find the hymen in some of the virgins he examined. This should have been a bombshell that shattered the practice of virginity testing. But society does not give up its tools of control easily. Even as medical science began to whisper that the seal was unreliable, the cultural demand for blood remained absolute. The sheet was more important than the science. The symbol mattered more than the truth. The burden of proof remained entirely on the woman to produce a physiological reaction that was not guaranteed by nature. This ignorance created a culture of deep anxiety surrounding the female body. Mothers and grandmothers, perhaps knowing the truth from their own secret experiences or the whispers of the village, understood that the test was rigged. They knew that a chaste life did not guarantee a bloody sheet. They understood that the body was unpredictable, and that a wedding night dictated by chance was a wedding night destined for disaster. The psychological weight of this myth of anatomy was suffocating. Women were alienated from their own bodies, taught to view their genitalia not as a part of themselves, but as a dangerous artifact that they were caretaking for a future husband. They lived in fear of an internal flaw they could not see and could not fee. Time 0.5s. Was the seal intact? Had they broken it by jumping over a stream? Had the washcloth been too rough? They were prisoners of a biological lottery where the losing ticket meant social death. Furthermore, the obsession with the hymen blinded society to the complexity of female sexuality. By reducing purity to a piece of skin, history reduced women to objects. A woman could be loyal, loving, and spiritually pure, but if she lacked a drop of blood on a linen sheet, she was worthless. Conversely, A woman could be cruel and deceitful, but if she bled, she was hailed as the ideal wife. The physical signifier had completely eclipsed the moral reality it was supposed to represent. As the centuries wore on, the pressure did not abate. If anything, the rising stakes of dowries and dynastic alliances made the need for proof even more desperate. But desperation breeds invention. If the game is rigged and the rules are based on a lie, then the only way to survive is to cheat. Women, realizing that their lives hung on a random biological occurrence, began to take matters into their own hands. They stopped relying on nature and started relying on artifice. In the shadows of the bedchambers, away from the prying eyes of priests and husbands, a secret industry began to thrive. It was an underground network of knowledge passed from sister to sister, from midwife to bride. If the world wanted blood, they would give it blood, but it would not be the blood of innocence. It would be the blood of survival. We are about to enter the hidden world of the counterfeit virgin. We will explore the ingenious, desperate, and sometimes gruesome methods women use to fake the test and save their lives. The sheet would be stained, the husband would be satisfied, and the lie would become history. When a system is built on a lie, survival depends on becoming a liar. For the countless women who knew, either through experience, accident, or simple anatomical bad luck, that they would not bleed on their wedding night, panic was the initial reaction. But panic soon gave way to pragmatism. If society demanded a specific visual cue to grant them safety and respect, they would provide it. Thus, a secret. History was written in the shadows of the bridal chamber, a history of faking virginity in history that reveals the desperate ingenuity of women backed into a corner. This was not a rare or isolated phenomenon. It was a pervasive underground economy of survival. In the bustling markets of medieval London, the back alleys of Renaissance Florence, and the hushed corners of apothecaries, solutions were whispered and sold. The goal was simple: reconstruct the seal or, more importantly, counterfeit the evidence of its breaking. The virginity fraud became a necessary skill, passed down from mother to daughter, or purchased from wise women who understood that the patriarchy's obsession with blood could be easily gamed. The methods ranged from the crude to the medically complex. The most common and direct approach was the use of external blood sources. A few days before the wedding, a bride might procure a small vial of animal blood. Pigeon blood was a favorite due to its consistency and color, though chicken or lamb blood would suffice. This vial could be hidden in a sponge, a piece of cotton, or even a fish bladder, and inserted into the body shortly before the consummation. In the heat and darkness of the moment, the vial would be crushed or the sponge squeezed, releasing the necessary proof onto the sheets. But the deception often had to be more sophisticated than just a stain. Men expected resistance. They expected the physical sensation of a barrier. To simulate this, women turned to astringents, ancient and medieval medical texts, including the famous Trotula, a compendium of women's medicine, contained recipes designed to constrict the passage. Brides were advised to bathe in water infused with oak bark, alum, nut galls, or red wine. These substances acted as powerful tightening agents, temporarily shrinking the tissues to mimic the tightness associated with virginity. Some methods were undeniably gruesome. In acts of sheer desperation, women would use leeches. A leech placed strategically inside the body shortly before the wedding night would engorge itself on blood. When the act of intercourse occurred, the leech would be crushed, releasing a terrifying amount of fresh human blood. It was a high-risk gamble. The pain, the potential for infection, and the horror of the act itself. But for a woman facing the prospect of public shaming or execution, a leech was a small price to pay for survival. The repair of virginity was not just folk magic. It was an early form of plastic surgery. As early as the 18th century in Europe, surgeons began quietly offering procedures to stitch the hymen back together. These operations were performed in secret, often for high-born women who had dallied before marriage and needed to restore their market value. It was a transaction of cynicism. The surgeon got his gold, the bride got her reputation, and the husband got his illusion. The existence of these practices exposes the absurdity of the entire system. Men believed they were the conquerors, the first explorers of a new land. In reality, they were often actors in a play directed by their wives. The husband would wake up, puff out his chest at the sight of the stained sheet, and accept the congratulations of his peers, never knowing that the purity he celebrated was nothing more than a fish bladder filled with pigeon blood. This deception required nerves of steel. Imagine the anxiety of the bride lying in the dark, the hidden vial uncomfortable inside her, praying that the timing would be perfect, that the trick would not be discovered. If a man found a piece of sponge or a shard of glass, the game was up. The punishment for such fraud was severe. In religious terms, it was a double sin, fornication followed by deceit. In legal terms, it was a breach of contract that could lead to severe physical punishment or public branding. Yet, women took the risk because the alternative was unthinkable. This art of deception was not malicious, it was defensive. It was the only weapon available to the powerless. By faking the signifier of their oppression, they nullified it. They allowed the patriarchal machine to keep turning, feeding it the lies it demanded so that they could live another day. But what of those who could not fake it? What of the women who were caught, or who were too innocent to know they needed to cheat? For them, there were no secret vials or astringent baths. There was only the cold morning light, the pristine white sheet, and the sudden, terrifying realization that they had failed the most important test of their lives. For these women, the consequences were not theoretical. They were brutal, physical, and often permanent. The society that had obsessed over their purity would now turn on them with a vengeance, eager to punish the damaged vessel. We must now turn our eyes to the aftermath of the failed test. The silence of the bedroom is about to be broken by the gavel of the judge and the jeers of the crowd. The sun rises over the village, casting long shadows across the cobblestones. But for the bride who wakes up to a pristine, white sheet, the world has effectively gone dark. The art of deception was a gamble, and for those who did not play it, or those who played and lost, the morning after the wedding was the beginning of a nightmare. We must now stare, unflinchingly, at the punishment for unchastity, a catalog of cruelty that reveals just how little a woman's life was worth when weighed against the pride of men. The immediate consequence of a failed test was a shattering of status. The moment the groom or the witnesses declared the sheet clean, the woman ceased to be a wife. She instantly reverted to the status of a liability. The wedding feast, often still laid out or in the process of being prepared for a second day of celebration, would be abandoned. The music stopped. The guests, sensing the shift in the air, would retreat, leaving the families to deal with the disgrace. In many cultures, the first step of punishment was the return. This was a literal transaction. The groom would pack the bride's belongings, her clothes, her linens, her small trinkets, and physically return her to her father's house. It was the return of defective merchandise. He would demand the repayment of the bride price or the dowry, often with interest or a penalty fee for the fraud committed against him. The shame of this procession cannot be overstated. To be marched back through the village, trailing a cart of one's possessions, was a public declaration that one was unwanted, used, and discarded. For the father, The return of a spoiled daughter was a financial and social catastrophe. His honor was stained by her perceived looseness. In his rage, the protection of the home often turned into a prison. The failed bride might be locked away in a cellar or an attic, time 0.3s, hidden from the eyes of neighbors who would whisper and point. She became a non-person, a ghost haunting her own family, a living reminder of their shame. If the family could not or would not take her back, the church offered a grim alternative: the convent. For centuries, nunneries served as the dumping ground for society's problem women. A girl who was deemed unmarriageable because of a lack of virginity was often forced to take the veil. But do not mistake this for a spiritual retreat, for a woman dragged there against her will. The convent was a penitentiary. She would spend the rest of her days in silence and labor, praying for forgiveness for a sin she may not have even committed. Her hair would be shorn, her name changed, and her identity erased. She was buried alive behind stone walls, dead to the world, so that her family could forget she existed. But for some, exile was not enough. The community demanded blood for the insult to its morals. In certain regions and eras, the law prescribed physical punishment for the unchaste bride. She might be stripped to the waist and whipped through the streets, a public spectacle designed to serve as a warning to other girls. In Puritan societies or strictly religious enclaves, she might be forced to wear a badge of shame, a distinct piece of clothing or a colored mark that announced her status to everyone she met. She was branded, literally or figuratively, ensuring that she could never hide her past. The horror reaches its zenith when we look at the highest levels of society. For a queen or a noblewoman, a failed test was not just a personal tragedy, it was treason. To counterfeit one's virginity when marrying a king was to defraud the crown. The penalty for treason was death. The ghost of Catherine Howard screams from the pages of history as the ultimate example of this brutality. The fifth wife of Henry VII, she was a teenager pushed into a marriage with an aging, obese, and tyrannical king. When her past sexual history came to light, evidence that she was not the rose without a thorn, Henry had deluded himself into believing she was. The machinery of the state turned on her with terrifying speed. She was not just divorced, she was hunted. Parliament passed a bill of attainder, making it high treason for a woman to marry the monarch if she was not a virgin. On the morning of her execution, Catherine was so weak with fear she had to be helped up the scaffold. She was a girl of maybe 19 years old. She was beheaded not because she had betrayed the country or sold secrets to an enemy, but because her body had a history before the king. Her head was displayed on a spike, a gruesome reminder that the king's right to exclusive property was backed by the executioner's axe. In more localized settings, away from the courts of kings, the honor killing was a dark reality. If a bride was returned, the father or brother, consumed by the need to cleanse the family name, might take her life. These murders were often tacitly ignored by the authorities. A jury of men would understand the provocation. They would see the father not as a murderer, but as a victim of his daughter's indiscretion. The woman's life was the price paid to restore the social standing of the men around her. What makes this violence so particularly hideous is the asymmetry of it. A man could frequent brothels, keep mistresses, and father illegitimate children, and on his wedding day, he was still considered a bachelor, a term of respect. His sexual history was written in disappearing ink, but a woman's history was carved in stone. One act, one mistake, or one biological anomaly could define her entire existence. She could be the kindest soul, the hardest worker, the most devout believer, but if the sheet was white, she was trash. The punishment was time, lives. It destroyed the woman's economic future, her social standing, her family relationships, and often her life. And it was all based on the premise that she had robbed her husband of something valuable. This brings us to the chilling realization that underscores this entire documentary. The anger of the husband, the rage of the father, the judgment of the priest. It wasn't really about morality. It wasn't about God. It was about business. The violence was so extreme because the theft was seen as so costly. To understand why a simple membrane was worth a woman's life, we must stop looking at these women as human beings and start looking at them as the men of the past did, as assets. We must look at the marriage contract not as a bond of love, but as a bill of sale, time 0.5s. The blood was not a symbol of purity. It was a receipt. And in the next part, we will examine the cold, hard economics of this transaction. We will see how land, money, and power were traded over the bodies of women, and why the virginity clause was the most important line in the contract. If we strip away the incense of the church, the velvet of the court, and the screaming of the mob, we are left with the cold, hard skeleton of the history of virginity testing. Economics. We have explored the religious fear and the social shame, but neither of these forces is powerful enough to sustain a system of oppression for thousands of years on its own. The engine that truly drove the obsession with female purity was money, property, time, power. To understand the brutality of the past, we must stop looking at the wedding as a ceremony of union and start seeing it for what it truly was: the signing of a business contract. In the medieval and early modern world, a medieval marriage contract was the most significant economic transaction a family would ever make. It was not a matter of two hearts beating as one. It was a merger of assets. For the peasantry, this meant the joining of adjacent fields, the acquisition of a milk cow, or the rights to a blacksmith's forge. For the nobility, it meant the acquisition of duchies, the settling of border disputes, and the forging of military alliances. In this high-stakes marketplace, the woman was not the negotiator. She was the currency. The bride was a liquid asset, moved from the ledger of her father to the ledger of her husband. But unlike a bag of gold or a deed to a castle, she was a volatile asset. She breathed, she felt, and most dangerously, she could reproduce. This biological capacity was the source of her value, but also the source of the buyer's paranoia. When a man purchased a wife through the exchange of a bride price or the receipt of a dowry, he was essentially buying a factory. The product of this factory was legitimate heirs. This brings us to the iron law of the era: primogeniture. In a world where land was the only real source of wealth, keeping that land intact was the primary goal of every patriarch. The estate had to pass to the eldest son. If the bloodline was diluted, if a cuckoo was introduced into the nest, a child fathered by another man but raised as the heir, the entire economic structure of the family would collapse. The ancestral lands would pass to a stranger's blood. The ghosts of the forefathers would be mocked. Therefore, virginity was the quality assurance seal on the factory. It was the only way the buyer, the husband, could be certain that the production line had not been tampered with by a competitor. A non-virgin bride represented a terrifying economic risk. She carried the potential of another man's seed. If she was already pregnant at the altar, the husband would spend his life raising, feeding, and eventually leaving his fortune to a child that did not carry his DNA. In the ruthless calculus of history, this was the ultimate swindle. This is why the language used to describe women in legal and personal documents of the time is often so chillingly agricultural. Men wrote of plowing their wives, of sowing seed in their fields. A wife was frequently compared to a broodmare or a prize heifer. When a nobleman looked for a bride, he scrutinized her breeding in the same way he would inspect a horse at a market. Was she from healthy stock? Were her hips wide enough for birthing? And, most importantly, was she unbroken? The virginity clause, whether written explicitly in the marriage settlements or understood implicitly by custom, was the warranty. If the goods were found to be damaged, not a virgin, the contract was void. The merchandise could be returned. Time 0.5s. The economic logic was brutal in its clarity. You do not pay full price for second-hand goods. This commodification went so far that the virginity of a bride could literally be calculated in gold. In many cultures, the mourning gift, a substantial sum of money or property given by the husband to the wife the day after the wedding, was conditional on the proof of blood. No blood, no payment. The bride's financial security, her widow's pension, her very ability to survive if her husband died, was contingent on that single moment of verification. She was earning her keep with her body. The system was designed to be devoid of sentiment. Consider the proxy marriages common among royalty. A princess could be married to a king she had never met, standing in a cathedral in her home country, while an ambassador stood in for the groom. To symbolize the consummation and make the contract legally binding, the ambassador would symbolically bed the bride, fully clothed. He would insert one bare leg into her bedsheets in front of witnesses. It was a sterile, bizarre pantomime of intimacy that highlighted the absurdity of the situation. The woman was being transferred like a parcel, stamped and signed for by a clerk. This economic view also explains why the punishment for adultery or unchastity was so severe for women, but non-existent for men. If a husband was unfaithful, he might waste some family money on a mistress, but he did not threaten the bloodline. He could not bring a false heir into the family womb. But if a wife was unfaithful, she jeopardized the genetic integrity of the entire estate. Time 0.5s. Her body was the vault where the family fortune, the DNA, was stored. Her infidelity was not just a moral failing, it was corporate sabotage. The tragedy of this merchandise and lineage system is how it stripped women of their personhood, reducing them to their biological utility. A woman could be brilliant, funny, artistic, and kind. But to the men signing the papers in the study, these were merely decorative features on the package. The core value, the only thing that made her worth the investment of land and title, was the exclusivity of her womb. Even the mothers, who loved their daughters, were forced to become enforcers of this cold trade. They were the ones who policed their daughters' virtue, who taught them to lower their eyes and guard their bodies. They were not doing this out of cruelty, but out of a desperate, pragmatic desire to see their children sold well. A spoiled daughter was a financial burden who would drag the rest of the family down. To protect her daughter from poverty, the mother had to train her to be a perfect product. As we look back at the long, dark corridor of history, we see that the blood on the sheets was never about God, or love, or even lust. It was about the anxiety of men who wanted to own the future. They built a cage of laws and lies to secure their immortality, and they put women inside it. The system was efficient. It worked for the men in charge. It secured dynasties that lasted for centuries. But the human cost was incalculable. Time 1.5s. It created a world where half the human race was viewed as property, their worth fluctuating with the integrity of a membrane. Now, we must bring this story to a close. The wedding guests have gone, the money has been counted, and the centuries have passed. The test has largely faded from the Western world, though its scars remain. In our final chapter, we will look at the legacy of this practice. We will stand in the quiet aftermath and reflect on the millions of women who lived and died by the stain. The conflict of the script is resolved. We understand the why. Now we must face the what now. The candles have burned down to pools of wax. The wedding feast is a distant memory, and the guests have long since returned to dust. We have journeyed through the marble temples of Rome, the drafty castles of medieval Europe, and the terrified silence of the bridal chamber. We have witnessed the history of virginity testing in all its brutal, bloody detail. We have seen how a simple biological function was weaponized by empires, sanctified by the church, and monetized by fathers and husbands. The obsession with the bloody sheet was never merely a quirky tradition of the past. It was the most potent symbol of a world where women were not the authors of their own stories, but merely the ink. As we stand at the end of this dark corridor, looking back at the centuries of fear and control, the most haunting realization is the silence. Millions of women lived their entire lives in the shadow of this test. They are the silent majority of history. Time, .5s. The peasant girl who prayed for blood, the queen who trembled before the jury of matrons, the desperate bride clutching a vial of pigeon blood. Their voices were never recorded. They were defined solely by the verdict of the morning after. If they passed, they became footnotes in a husband's genealogy. If they failed, they were erased. The legacy of virginity testing is not a relic that we can simply place in a museum case and admire with detached curiosity. It is a scar on the collective psyche of humanity that has not fully healed. While the formal ceremony of the sheet has largely vanished from the Western world, the ghost of the clean sheet still haunts the modern bedroom. The physical ritual may be gone, but the mental architecture remains. We see it in the lingering double standards of our own time. We see it in the way society still whispers about a woman's body count, a term that reduces her history to a numerical score, while a man's history is treated as a badge of experience. We see it in the enduring myth that a woman's value depreciates with every partner she takes, a direct echo of the medieval belief that she was damaged goods. The purity culture that permeates so many corners of the globe today is the direct descendant of the medieval theologians' fear and the ancient Romans' control. The sheet is no longer linen, but the judgment remains just as stark. It is uncomfortable to admit, but the machinery of control we have dismantled in this series was terrifyingly effective. It worked. It secured the lines of succession for the kings of Europe. It ensured that the land stayed in the family name. It built the dynasties that shaped the modern world, but the cost was the dehumanization of half the human species. The great houses of history were built on a foundation of female anxiety. Every stone in the castle wall was cemented with the silent terror of a girl waiting for a drop of blood to save her life. There is a profound tragedy in the fact that so much suffering was based on a lie. The myth of anatomy that we explored, the belief in a standard, unbreakable seal, was a fiction maintained by men who refused to see the complexity of the bodies they claimed to own. How many innocent women were cast out, beaten, or killed because of a biological anomaly? How many lives were ruined because a piece of tissue did not behave according to a man's inaccurate medical textbook? The arrogance of this ignorance is the true horror of the story. Time 0.3s amidst this darkness. We must also remember the resistance. We must remember the art of deception. Those women who faked the test, who used sponges and vials and leeches, were not just survivors. They were rebels. In a system designed to crush them, they found a way to seize control of their own destiny. They looked the patriarchy in the eye and lied to it, forcing it to accept them on their own terms. Their deception was an act of supreme bravery, a quiet revolution fought in the privacy of the bedchamber. They proved that while men could make the laws, they could not fully conquer the human spirit's will to survive. As we close the book on this chapter of history, let us look at the white sheet. One last time. It is just a piece of fabric. Time 0.5s. It is woven from flax, bleached by the sun, and folded by human hands. It has no moral weight. It has no divine power. It cannot speak. It cannot judge. It is, and always was, just a sheet. The power it held was given to it by a society afraid of the unknown, a society that needed to simplify the mystery of human connection into a binary pass-fail test. We have moved beyond the sheet, but we must remain vigilant against the ideas that wove it. We must ensure that value is never again defined by biology, and that honor is never again measured in blood. The sun has risen. The test is over. The judges have left the room, and for the first time in millennia, the woman standing in the center of the chamber is free to define herself.